Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast diving deep into nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the 25th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 33 or Proper 28, which this year falls on November 19th.
We are so close to the end of the season after Pentecost. So close!
It's almost here!
Yeah. Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive for this episode, we decided that, the parable for the gospel is not my favorite at all. And so we're doing currency.
Also not our favorite? I mean, the parable is about currency. We are talking about currency.
Yes. Yeah.
And some of the after effects of currency.
Yeah. Anyway, part of this will be demystifying, demythizing?
Demythologizing?
Myth-busting.
Yes.
Myth-busting some of the myths that exist around currency and money. And just kind of like giving a deeper understanding of that, as well as currency, inflation, all of those lovely things. So money has four main purposes. 1 is a means for exchanging goods and services. 2, payment of debts. 3, to calculate the prices of items when it's like representing a general or shared measure of value.
Sure.
And 4, when it is stored, it is a wealth reserve.
I tend to think of reason number 4 as the Scrooge McDuck purpose. Because if you can't go swimming in it, then really what's the point?
Exactly.
Yeah. When we decided to do a currency episode, I had a couple of thoughts come to mind, and I'll bring up another one later about currency showing up in pop culture. But the very first thing that came to mind for me was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, which has this lovely passage on currency. So, from Hitchhiker's Guide, in fact, there are 3 freely convertible currencies in the galaxy, but none of them count. The Altarian dollar has recently collapsed. The Flanian Pobblebead is only exchangeable for other Flanian Pobblebeads. And the Triganic Poo has its own very special problems. Its exchange rate of 8 Ningis to 1 Poo is simple enough. But since a Ningi is a triangular rubber coin, 6,800 miles along each side, no one has ever collected enough to own 1 Poo. Ningis are not negotiable currency because galactobanks refuse to deal in fiddling small change. From this basic premise, it is very simple to prove that the galactobanks are also the product of a deranged imagination, which possibly might give a hint about how seriously I tend to take this sort of thing. But
yeah.
Currency has a useful purpose, but it is also, possible to turn it into an idol. And by making jokes like this about it, it is helpful to remind us that it is not actually in charge of the universe.
What? Yeah, truth. And so the main myth around currency and money that kind of gives a hint at like how it became so important and, well, how it was justified as being so important and how it has come to feel like a thing that controls the universe is the myth that currency came about to replace bartering. This was published in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which in 1776, he's an economist, he's not an anthropologist, he's not a historian. He was just making stuff up so that it would help justify his purposes. Anthropologists have done a lot more research and stuff, and currency actually did not come about to replace bartering.
Wait, so you mean that we've learned some things since 1776, and maybe things that we thought back then can't really guide us for today's world?
What? Huh. Amazing. Yeah, so mainstream economists have assumed that bartering of goods and services inspired money's invention, but anthropologists and archaeologists have, done the research, and they're contending that early states invented currency as a means of debt payment. So it's very much tied towards nations and states and empires and those sorts of things, much more than a system of bartering, which I think is interesting because it shows that instead of coming from the ground up, it is definitely a top-down thing. And there's a lot of different places where credit and debt exist and existed.
Sure.
And were part of it. So there were older systems of credit and debt like bride prices or dowries, right? When marriages were very much about social and economic policies and things and alliances. Whereas now a lot of the time they're more about love and wanting to build a future together and family and those sorts of things. So that sort of a dynamic, then like you could trade one bride for you get their next bride kind of thing from the other family.
Yeah.
And the transition to a more money-friendly debt started at least 5,500 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And that's where they started to have something that gets to be more like money. So Mesopotamia had the silver shekel, which was just a lump of silver. It was not a coin. And that equaled one bush of barley. And then farmers were taxed to support, their feudal lords and kings and things, and for the purpose of public works. And so if they couldn't pay in the goods that they produced, so in their harvest, then it was recorded as debt in shekels. And so then the other piece of that is that merchants and traders would get goods from temples and palace officials on credit. And so this also kind of all combined to like set it up that it could easily become a more standardized money thing. And the first coins actually that were like stamped with images of animals or rulers to like assure their value first appeared in Lydia in what is now Turkey 2,600 years ago.
To be clear, we're talking about Lydia the city, not Lydia a person.
Yes, not the person.
That would be awkward.
Yeah, that'd be a little weird to have coins just appear inside of you.
Mm-hmm. Please don't swallow currency. That's a terrible idea.
Yeah, that's the bad idea. And so from the start, these coins were used to fund armies and wars of conquest, and then became legal tender for other transactions, leading to marketplaces and that sort of a thing, not coming from marketplaces and that sort of a thing. So it's just like, I think it's just really interesting where the origins actually come from. And you can see there is a particular thing that like for economists who their money comes from money, right? They have a distinct incentive in getting everybody to think that money is always has been and always will be and is a good thing and comes from a good place. And so then when you start to figure out, it actually comes from this very hierarchical place and this way of propping up people who already have power and resources, then it helps us think about money differently.
And how we might be able to change the concepts that money is based on. Yeah. Exactly. So the second thing that came to mind for me when we started talking about this, which I then promptly forgot about until just now, was that there is a delightful trope in science fiction. And this is the thing that the people of Earth thought of, and literally no one else in the galaxy has ever invented this. And in the TV show Torchwood, they said that thing was camping. The idea of recreationally leaving your home and going and making a temporary place and enjoying nature. And oddly enough, in Robert Heinlein's book, A Stranger in a Strange Land, which has so many issues. Anyway, it's an interesting book, and it's a great look at the thought processes of science fiction authors from that time period. But the thing that Robert Heinlein tried to imagine in that book that only Earth ever created was currency. And I had a lot more trouble buying that than I did with Torchwood saying that camping was the thing that only we had ever come up with. Because currency is, like, on the one hand, yes, it does come from a hierarchical place. On the other hand, standardizing how we exchange things is a pretty basic concept. And having some kind of a symbolic way to understand the amounts of things that we exchange and the amounts of things that we need is pretty reasonable. So while we can certainly rethink the structure of how we think about money and what power we give it in our lives and all that kind of thing, and I am totally for that, I have trouble buying Heinlein's concept that we were the only ones in the universe to ever come up with money.
Well, and especially when, and we'll get into this in a minute, but it developed in different places.
Yes.
Independently.
Exactly.
And not in the same way.
Right?
Like, it's not all developing in the same way or for the same purpose exactly, but some sort of currency did develop in the Americas before European settlers and in Mesopotamia. And
Sure. So when we read the Bible, there are several currencies mentioned. I'm not going to go into all of them because, frankly, that could be a whole separate podcast, and we've already done like 2.5 podcasts on taxes where we went into that. And so,
which we'll link to.
Yes. And basically, the two that people tend to think about when they think about money in the Bible are the denarius, which was the daily wage of a laborer. So you would receive 1 denarius in exchange for 1 day of work. And also the talent, which, oddly enough, comes up in this Bible passage that we're reading today.
Weird.
And the talent was representative of more like several years' wages for probably multiple people. Like, this is a huge amount of money. Like, you would need several generations of a large family to go into that much debt, right? It's a lot. This is the closest that we get to having billionaires in the Bible.
Yeah, and it's much closer to like millionaires.
Well, yes, but like this is still a
but it is the closest, yeah.
And there are various other like individual specific coins that show up in the Bible in various places. The coin with Caesar's face on it that Jesus is shown in the temple from a few weeks back is probably a temple penny or a temple tribute penny and is not actually a denarius. I was looking that up earlier. And there are a few others. But basically, those two are the ones we tend to think of most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's part of it. And that also connects to what we were talking about before. And in what is now the Americas, systems of marketplaces were already thriving before European colonizers came. And they used cacao beans and woven cloth as kind of a currency. So those were used to buy stuff, to pay taxes and debts, to calculate monetary values, and to store familial wealth. And so that's an interesting thing because it is something that is of value, but also something that is perishable, right? Cacao beans are not going to last forever.
And storing textiles is a whole actual industry at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was kind of appearing during the really abundant times in Maya history from about 250 to 900 CE, which is much earlier than the originally thought of 1100. And that also like the trading of fine textiles before taxation or tribute to royalty. So it came before they were doing things like taxes. So I think that that's interesting that like there is a way of doing currency that did develop in the Americas while currency was also developing elsewhere. And I think it's interesting that, I don't know, I guess it feels less artificial if it's textiles and weavings and cacao beans, because those are things that also have their own inherent value in a way that like a silver shekel has value because it's metal, but only because we give that metal value. Yeah. And so that kind of like brings us into today where money and currency has developed in a variety of capacities and is fairly standardized today and fairly regulated, which I will mention in a minute, the places where that gets a little off track. But a lot of countries actually call their currency the crown, a crown. So coruna, there's kind of a lot of different ways, but like if you know the language or the word for crown in a given country's language, you might just know the name of their currency as well, which is fascinating to me that like, I mean, it ties it in with like the royalty and the empire and hierarchy stuff. And the US currency has been adopted by a lot of other countries, usually because of really problematic contexts. So in the like scheme of currency proliferation, I guess, the euro has been adopted by the most countries, and there are 20 like member countries who all like jointly oversee the euro. And then there are others who like once their own currency gets to a place where they can just join in, they will. And then there are other countries who have unilaterally adopted the euro and they don't get any representation. They just use the euro and have gotten rid of their own currency, which frequently happens when there is some sort of financial crisis or dangerous inflation tactics, that sort of a thing. And is a lot of what happened for the US dollar to be used by 22 different countries. Some of those are colonies or territories, as we call them today to sound a little bit less terrible, like Puerto Rico and Guam and those sorts of places. But also there are other countries like Ecuador and El Salvador, both of which have had a fair amount of like US intervention because we're an empire and that's what we do. But they have unilaterally adopted the US dollar. So they have said, okay, our currency is too volatile, our currency is not stable enough, whatever the reason, we're going to just use the US dollar now. And so, like, when I did a January term in college in Ecuador, I didn't have to change my money out. I just used the dollar. And, like, they still had some coins that they used from their local currency, but for the most part, I just paid with the money I already had. And it's interesting to trace because it makes it really easy for those of us in the US who travel to travel to those countries. But also, there's definitely a sense of empire and colonialism to whether or not they were actually former colonies or current colonies. There is a sense of colonialism in whose money is used and that sort of a thing. And then the other two that also have like a kind of a prolific spread in currency is the Australian dollar, which is used by 11 countries. 3 of them are independent countries, and then the rest are Australia and territories. And then the sterling, which is also known as the pound or the British pound or the pound sterling, is used by 10 countries, all of which are like Great Britain and territories. So that one is not quite as widespread beyond the ones that it is directly the colonizer for. And then also we would be remiss if we didn't mention cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is fake and is kind of like Airbnb and Uber and all of these like things that are like something that has regulations but without the regulation, right?
And therefore without the safety protocols.
Yeah, so Airbnb is like hotels but without the regulations and safety. Uber, like taxis, without the regulations and safety and good labor practices.
Yeah.
Cryptocurrency, like real currency, but without the regulations.
A remarkable number of divorces in the last handful of years have been due to folks dabbling in cryptocurrency and, say, losing their entire life savings or retirement accounts because they are not insured by the federal government.
Yeah. So one of the most kind of well-known ones is Sam Bankman-Fried who did like Bitcoin and stuff, was found guilty of fraud. So if you are thinking about getting into cryptocurrency, maybe think twice. Like there are countries that are moving away from physical currency. That's a different thing because the country itself is backing that.
Yes.
It's not the same as cryptocurrency, which is not backed and not insured. And
And also, is supposedly created by thousands of computers running programs that take up a lot of energy and power and are steadily, helping to kill the planet. So
yeah, we don't actually want to kill the planet.
Some of us still live here.
What? Some of us can't afford rocket ships to take us away and might not want them even if we could afford them.
Sure.
And that brings us to kind of today and kind of how currencies and inflation and all of that works. Argentina, I think, is a really good example of this right now. Since the dictatorship, they've kind of had like some ups and downs with their own currency and a fair amount of fluctuation with it. Right now, their inflation is at like 140%, I think, which is ridiculously high and has put about 40% of their population into poverty because when bread goes from $10 to $14, that's a huge increase when you're probably not getting an increase in pay. And the United States has had some of that where like wages have stagnated, but everything else keeps going up. This is why a cost of living adjustment is not a pay raise.
Right.
It is mitigation so you're not taking a pay cut.
Right.
While most people have actually been taking pay cuts. But the Argentine financial situation right now is bad. And they're in a precarious part of how that plays out, right? Because money impacts so much. They are in a runoff race for president because nobody got 50%. And it's now between this guy that wants to like cut everything and just hop onto the US dollar and not just like that part, but like cut spending on infrastructure, on safety nets, on all of this stuff. He like has a chainsaw that John Oliver did a lovely special on it that I will try and find that particular part where he's talking about Argentina within the context of the other stuff he's talking about because it's just ridiculous. But he is going up against the current finance minister. And so that's
Right.
particularly difficult because when you're not happy with the economic situation, trying to get a finance minister, the current finance minister, to be
Yeah.
president, and there's other stuff, right? Like, it's not all just this finance minister who's making the economic situation in Argentina so volatile and so awful, but it's a tricky place. So we'll see how their elections go.
Sure. So in America, when we talk about inflation, we're often used to talking about inflation of the American dollar over time. And so I tried to come up with an example of how we can talk about how inflation has changed what, say, the American dollar can buy in your ordinary neighborhood in, let's say, the last 50 years, since 1973. It's a nice round number, 50 years, not 1973. And in order to look at this, I've also been using a inflation calculator, which is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we will link to in the episode description. And I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that inflation calculators aren't an exact science, because different resources have different supply and demand amounts, and therefore the rates for, say, paying for a college education have changed in a different way than paying for a gallon of milk, have changed in a different way than paying for a new car, that kind of thing. But due to my personal background, I thought that one of the most illustrative changes in the cost of things over the last 50 years might be to look at a college education, specifically in regards to tuition and room and board. And I wanted to find a large university, preferably a state university, to look at, because state universities, their costs have stayed somewhat more stable over the years than private universities in general.
I was going to say, when I was looking at this, I was like, well, that's very different from what I paid.
Yeah. Well, and Emily and I both went to college a while back, and so costs have continued to change since then.
And we went to private college.
Yeah. And so when I chose a university, I went with the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, because I didn't want to pick a university that was in, say, like Chicago, Minneapolis, New York, places where the cost of living is incredibly high. Minneapolis somewhat less than Chicago and New York, but still very high.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to pick a larger city that was still somewhat reasonable cost of living and also still a major school. I had to go onto their website and download a spreadsheet in order to find the 1973 costs. You're welcome. And also I wanted to point out that my comparisons here don't include books, supplies, personal expenses, travel to and from school. We're just looking at tuition and room and board. And we're going to specifically look at the state residents' costs. People who live in the state of Illinois, what would they pay? Because, again, I wanted to keep things comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And so in 1973, I believe this is a year's tuition, would have cost you $496. Now, if you use the inflation calculator to translate that into today's money, that would cost you in 2023 dollars, $3,378.
That's like...
If you can find a college that will only ask that much of you, by all means go there, as long as they're accredited, for crying out loud.
Right, make sure they're accredited.
Yeah. And
not private.
Room and board, again, for a year, in 1973, would have cost you $1,260. That's both your room and the food you eat in the cafeteria. And if you translate that into today's money, it would cost you about $8,580. Again, very reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very good cost.
Yeah, I pay more than that per month for where I live.
Yeah, so if you put those together, you are paying not quite $2,000 in 1973 money for a year's worth of tuition and room and board. And now, that's still serious money in 1973 currency. But you can see how back then people could pay for going to college with a good summer job and having like a part-time job during the school year. That's reasonable, right?
Totally doable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's jump into the 2023 tuition and room and board. The tuition varies a bit in 2023 depending on which program you're going into, but the absolute cheapest tuition available for a full-time student at Champaign-Urbana right now is $17,572. That's compared to the 2023 translation of the 1973 tuition, which was $3,378, right? So this is like over 5 times more.
Yeah.
And if you translate that $17,000 number into 1973 money, in 1973 you would have been paying $2,581. That's not a summer
Which is
job.
like double the room and board for the entire year.
That's actually
just
more
for
than
the
5
tuition.
times. Yeah, more than 5 times the 1973 price. Yeah, of the $496. Yeah. And then if you look at the cost for room and board in 2023, these days, the basic price is $13,938. Now, I believe that's the absolute cheapest dorm and food plan that you've got. And I didn't really want to go with a really expensive room and board plan because I do want to acknowledge that these days your room in a college is going to be way more technology friendly. And I'm not just talking about internet, although I am talking about internet, but also like in 1973, your room in a college dorm was almost certainly not air conditioned no matter how much money you were paying. And these days, a lot of them are. And so some cost difference makes sense.
Yeah.
But almost $14,000 compared to the 2023 translated price from 73, which was $8,500, that's still a big difference. If you translate the almost $14,000 number from today into 1973 money, that's $2,047 compared to $1,260. So that's still a big jump. Some of that is probably the technology, but still.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting, and this is where like public universities are trickier. Like, so full disclosure, I'm also looking at the numbers. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to keep track of what.
Yeah, I tried to make that as clear as I could, but
but you could easily look up something like this.
Sure.
But the tuition is now more expensive than the room and board plan, and part of that is that states have stopped funding colleges. And it happened largely in, surprising no one, the Reagan era, because states paying for public universities and covering those costs was actually helping particularly Black, Indigenous people of color get an education and be able to afford it and get a good education. And because that was working, then during Reaganomics, they decided to decrease funding, and we've been on that same trajectory ever since. And so the less a state funds a public university, the more that cost gets passed on to students, even when they could probably figure out costs differently. And so it's just fascinating to me that like room and board has not increased. Both have increased a lot, but
the
room and board has not increased nearly as much as tuition.
Yeah, the tuition has increased either 4 or 5 times, depending on whether you want to translate those numbers in the dollars of 1973 or in 2023. But the room and board translates to less than twice as much. Like, that's still a lot, but still,
but not nearly as much. And if we look at wages have not increased in the same ways.
No.
So
gracious.
the money that you're making,
now, but not by that much.
You're making more, but if you do the inflation calculations, right, you're not making more now than you were in 1973.
Not for the power of what you can buy.
Yeah. And so there's that too, that like you can't work full-time all summer and part-time during the school year and afford it without some sort of help from somewhere.
Yeah. If you want to explore how prices have changed due to inflation further, there is a website which I find endlessly fascinating called wishbookweb.com. And they have a whole bunch of old Christmas catalogs on this website, dating back to the earliest one is from 1937. There are a bunch of Sears catalogs and also catalogs from other companies. But it's really interesting to see how the buying power of a dollar has changed over the years. I particularly remember being shocked to see that in, say, the 40s, say just after World War II, you could buy a really nice wool cardigan that, like, if it's made out of real wool, it'll last you 10, 15 years or more if you take care of it. You could buy that for $10. These days, a real wool cardigan will cost you almost $100 easily.
Yeah.
And so the buying power has really changed. And some of those prices change differently. Like you'll notice that the prices of, a foldable side table, for example, has changed less than the prices of clothes. The price of, the makeup offered nowadays on Sears website is probably not the very fanciest stuff you can buy, but the stuff offered in the, say, 1950s in these catalogs was very affordable. And so we will link directly to a catalog from 1973. They only had 2 catalogs from 1973, and one of them is Canadian, and I figured getting foreign currency conversion confused into this would be a little much. And so instead, we are linking to one from a company called Eaton's, because they didn't actually have a Sears catalog from 1973. But also, I would encourage you to take a look at the catalogs from other years, 1937 and forward. They have them through the 1990s. Seeing some of the ads for the very, very early computers are just hilarious. However, I will warn you that in my experience of looking through these catalogs, the misogyny is pretty much not surprising. Again, they're trying to sell you stuff, so most of it's not hugely insulting. It's just, wow, I can tell that they would phrase this differently now. But then every so often, the racism will come out of the woodwork and beat you about the head. That tends to be much more unexpected. The misogyny is a constant undercurrent, yeah. And the racism just every so often gets real obvious. But there is also an interesting pattern of increasing inclusion, because one of the very first things that you see that they are acknowledging that, say, Black people exist is that they start selling Black baby dolls. And at first, the way that those are talked about is incredibly insulting and horrifying. But then as time goes on, you start seeing them. These are just other baby dolls that look different. And it's just part of the ad copy, and it's more inclusive. And so it's a really interesting, I can say as a white person, it's a really interesting look at how the way that advertising work changed over the years.
Yeah.
But also, I do want to warn you, that is a thing to contend with. So
good to know. Yeah. So, currency.
Yay.
Inflation. And we didn't even get into the Federal Reserve and all of those things, because that's well beyond our pay grades here at Nerds at Church, where we work for basically free.
Love. Yes. Love. They call it a labor of love because that's what you get paid. Yeah.
It's true. Yeah. Are you curious about how the Twilight Saga is influenced by Mormon theology?
Or why so many vampires are queer-coded?
Have you sat up at night pondering if the documentary Jesus Camp counts as a horror film?
Or have you ever wondered which slasher icon is which member of the Trinity?
Do you ever get into debates about whether the movies Casper, Ghost, and Candyman can be part of the Ghostbusters expanded universe?
Have you watched most of the Nightmare on Elm Street series before the age of 10?
What? Who does that?
Okay, maybe that one's just me. But if you answered yes to any of the other questions, then we've got the podcast for you.
And if you answered yes to Pace's question.
That too. I'm Pace, and I am the super nerdy horror person who's been a horror fan since well before the age when it was appropriate to watch these movies.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and I am the inevitable queer coding somewhere in every horror movie. And we are the hosts of Horror Nerds at Church, a ridiculously queer podcast hosted by 2 non-binary trans nerds.
Each season we follow a horror franchise and a host of other horror and horror-adjacent movies to talk about how they connect to queerness, religion, and theology.
We feature bona fide scary movies like Halloween, The Witch, Candyman, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Suspiria.
We also have non-scary movies or low-stake horror movies like Ghostbusters, The Addams Family, Doctor Strange, and Hocus Pocus.
Our upcoming season, we are covering a galaxy far, far away by looking at the Star Wars and Alien franchises from queer, religious, and horror points of view.
So whether you're a lifelong horror master like me,
or a horror Padawan like me,
we have a place for you at Horror Nerds at Church.
Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you catch your podcasts.
Our first reading for this episode is from Zephaniah, chapter 1, verses 7 and 12 through 18. The prophet announces that the day of the Lord and great destruction is coming near.
So one thing I noticed about this passage is that it's like the Nerds at Church recent hits list. We've got lamps, we've got vineyards, there's so much in this passage. And we'll gladly link to that for you all if you are curious. But also the other piece is this idea that God does pick sides. And it's not that of the rich and powerful. So Scrooge McDuck, not on God's side. But we are entering the time period where A Christmas Carol might come back into vogue. And so in those cases, we know that Bob Cratchit and the Cratchits tend to be more the ones that God is going to pick. And I'll just shout out a reminder that if you're a Patreon supporter, you can get access to our movie commentary from last year on the Muppets Christmas Carol and our upcoming movie commentary now that it looks like the actor strike is also over, and our movie commentary on 4 Weddings and a Funeral. So yeah, extra incentive to become Patreon supporters in this new adventure we are about to begin of a 4th season that will look very different from the current season setups. Yeah. Also, diving into the verses, the first part of verse 12, I was struck by. God says, "At that time, I will search Jerusalem with lamps." And my immediate reaction, because of my own particular context, is, so an ADHD God? Like, what got misplaced? What are you searching for? Literally, our house the other day had one person looking for a misplaced thing, which led to others of us helping them look for that misplaced thing. And then in the helping and in the looking, the thing kept getting moved around under stuff, and so it never got found. And then finally it got found, and then it was, okay, wait, now where's my... For me, it was a phone. Where's my phone?
Yeah.
Like, what happened to that? I had it just now. Yeah.
I love having clothes with pockets that actually fit my phone in them. Yeah. In verse 13, we read, God says, "Their wealth shall be plundered, and their houses laid waste. Though they build houses, they shall not inhabit them. Though they plant vineyards, they shall not drink wine from them." And I want to be clear that this is not God saying that they will not live in their houses in a housing crisis with rich folks trying to make money off of inflating real estate prices and therefore refusing to let people live in the many properties that they already own while the value continues to increase way. Like, that is not
because
what
they
God is
just
talking
might
about.
be Airbnb houses.
Yeah, for that matter. But rather, God is talking more along the lines of a tear the tyrants down from their thrones kind of way, like in the Magnificat. So keep that in mind. There was no Airbnb in the ancient world, thank goodness. For so many reasons, really. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that would be horrible. Also, they just, like, let people stay with them when they were traveling. Like, you just provided hospitality because people were traveling, and you had to do that because you just did that.
On the one hand, I am totally in favor of the biblical concept of hospitality and encouraging that in people. On the other hand, the idea of showing up at a stranger's house and having to live with them for multiple days gives me the screaming heebie-jeebies as an introvert. So, like, yeah. Anyway, moving on.
That's real.
Yeah.
That's real.
And then in verse 15, we read, God says, "That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness." And okay, this first made me jump back to our recent episode on lighting and history, which Emily already brought up very capably. But also, I feel like I need to remind ourselves that this would be a much more serious issue in the ancient world than we think of it now because we have electric lights. And so we get to hide inside when the weather is like this. They would still be hiding inside, most likely, if it was storming, but also, like, it would be so much darker. Oh my goodness. And it also made me think of the fact that in the game of Skyrim, you can fix this problem with a clear skies shout, because that game actually gives you a power that just fixes the weather and literally clears the skies. You get it partway through the game.
Whoa.
But for various somewhat plot-related reasons, it does feel kind of weird. Like, there is a solid plot reason why you're given that power, but it still feels like that was a weird choice for them to make in the first place. But
okay. And then in verse 17, God says, I will bring such distress upon people that they shall walk like the blind, because they have sinned against God. Their blood shall be poured out like dust, and their flesh like dung. So a reminder that using disabilities as metaphors for incompetence or badness is bad.
Yeah.
And ableist. And so what it seems like maybe is actually being said is they will walk like they don't know where they're going and they don't know how to get there.
Sure.
And they can't. Yeah. Which reminded me of actually like in A Torch Against the Night, the second Ember in the Ashes book, the group is trying to get to a place through the desert and there's a sandstorm that gets brought up and Elias ties the group together so that they won't get lost in the sandstorm, so that they can keep moving that way. And then, plot twist. But that feels like that kind of a like, we're not sure where we're going, we got to stay together, we got to figure this out kind of slowly finding their way forward. Yeah. Our second reading for this episode is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. The author encourages us to keep awake and be alert for surprises that may come. So one of the themes in this passage, which also came up a little bit in the last passage, is the idea of night and day and good and bad, and this, first off, false binary that is created there of like Thessalonians goes into it really deeply of like, be people of the day and not of the night, and night is always bad and day is always good, and that mixing with like light and darkness and all of the ways that becomes really problematic. And so I will remind you of two of my favorite children's books. One is Sulwe by Lupita Nyong'o, which is fantastic and actually talks about people in terms of day and night and kind of shifting that perspective. And also God's Holy Darkness, which friend of the podcast, Pastor Nick Peñaranda, illustrated with Cherie Green and Becca Selnick.
It's wonderful.
Who co-wrote it. It's fantastic. Highly recommend both of those if you have not yet purchased them. But they help get at this, like, it's not what we think, right? Like, part of this is hiding and not being open with what you're doing.
Yeah.
Doing things in secret is what they're really talking about. Again, taking out the, like, super problematic stuff and, like, figuring out what they're actually trying to say and saying that instead of the super problematic stuff.
Sure. So as we jump into the verses, in verse 1 we read, Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers and sisters and siblings, you do not need to have anything written to you. And I think it was Rabbi Maurice Applebaum who told us about how one of the very first things that the Jewish people sort of invented together was a calendar.
That sounds right.
And
especially given what he was there for our episode.
Yeah, we were talking about the Passover. And so that was part of what held the Jewish people together as a people and as a culture in their very earliest days, having a calendar that they shared. And probably there weren't that many formerly Jewish people in the church at Thessalonica, to be fair, who the author's writing this letter to. But these folks instead may have been using several different calendars, and probably they also would have been generally defaulting to the calendar of the Roman Empire. But apparently, whatever calendar it is that they are using, they have it figured out because, the author is not having to explain that to them.
Indeed.
Good for them.
Yeah. And then in verse 3, the author writes, when they say, there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. And I can't read that without thinking about, like, the places where security is lifted up so much. Yeah. Israel's security has been huge, and it's in this sense of the Pax Romana, right? Security through threat or active violence to suppress dissent. The author is here being like, when you think that you can achieve your own security, look out, because it's a false sense of security. And it also reminded me of the Capitol in the Hunger Games, where they're like, yeah, everything is great and everything is fine and everything is peaceful and secure. And they even keep saying that after, like, all of the rebellions start and people are, like, revolting in the districts and the capital is still like, doo-doo-doo. Yeah.
The ostrich with their head in the sand. Probably for similar reasons, too.
Mm-hmm.
And then in verse 5, we read, "For you are all children of light and children of the day. We are not of the night or of darkness." And it didn't really occur to me while we were doing our deep dive on lighting and history, but it does strike me that being a night owl in the ancient world must have been kind of miserable. I can't even imagine what with how expensive and difficult lighting was, and how likely you were to set yourself on fire. And it's not like you had a bender from the Fire Nation around the corner to provide light for you at any hour of the day or night. And so that would have been so much more difficult. I am no longer a night owl due to medication, but I remember that time of my life, and electric light was vital to literally everything. So
It's true. Although I imagine night owls probably were doing less studying and work and things, and like maybe other things that didn't require as much.
Sure, like knitting. Or the ancient
Facility.
version of
Yeah.
yes, which some folks can do without having to look at what they're doing.
It's true. And then in verse 10, we read, "Our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with Christ." And I read this and I'm like, well, that's good news for both insomniacs and people with narcolepsy. It's okay if you're asleep. It's okay if you're awake. No matter what.
He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake.
Oh my gosh, please send us hate mail for doing Christmas. This is the second Christmas reference we've made in this episode.
It's not Advent yet, we're fine.
Is that how it works? You can do Christmas
as long as
before Advent and after Advent, yes. But not during. Okay.
It's like
okay, glad.
Wearing white after Labor Day?
White after Labor Day, yeah. Yeah, totally, that's how it works.
And then our final reading for this episode is from Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30, what we've all been waiting for. Jesus tells the parable of the talents, illustrating the concept of investments.
So, honestly, not a fan of this parable.
I believe you've mentioned that, yes.
Yeah, it just feels like capitalism to me, which we did an episode on that with Dr. Felipe Maya that we will link to for you all if you want to dig more into that. Again, from last year. But it literally requires some to not have enough. And nothing in my brain makes this make sense. But it reminded me of, there's a book that I got and read a while ago, like not quite a decade ago, but a while ago. That's The Girl Who Was on Fire, which is a collection of essays about the Hunger Games from other young adult authors.
Sure.
And so they get into like how reality TV could like connect to the Hunger Games and that sort of thing. But part of it is capitalism and how capitalism like lends itself towards something like the Hunger Games situation, because it requires people to not have enough and it requires some to have an abundance. And yeah.
So as we jump into the verses, in verse 18 we read, "But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money." And I was recently listening to an Ologies podcast episode about squirrels, or technically about squirrelology, which is totally not what they call it, but the study of squirrels. And squirrels do bury acorns and other foodstuffs in order to hide them from other squirrels, but apparently they're also kind of famous for always taking 1 bite out of something before they bury it. And we're not sure if it's that they are just agreeing with us about the first bite of anything is always the best thing, because that is totally possible. Or are they just making sure that this item is not rotten or, at a stage where it won't keep long enough for them, and they can tell that by taste. Like it's unclear how much advanced planning versus how much, impulse indulging this is. But apparently also squirrels will totally do this to garden vegetables, which they don't even bother stealing. They will just take 1 bite out of your zucchini or your pepper or your any number of other things. And I know quite a few folks who have gotten very irritated indeed with the squirrels in their area, because this is just infuriating.
So okay, my mom once upon a time had a squirrel that was hiding their nuts in her vent for her dryer.
Oh goodness.
And she had like somebody come in and clean it out and stuff, and the squirrels around her house are pretty territorial, and so there like after it got cleaned out, the whole pile of like the nuts and stuff ended up on her front step. And every time she went out the door, the squirrel would yell at her.
Well, of course, she had destroyed its winter stash. How dare she?
Yeah, I think it was in the springtime,
Oh, goodness.
too. So, like, it was like a leftover stash. I don't know. It was hilarious to hear about and a
goodness.
little bit unnerving, I
would
think, for
imagine.
her to
Yeah, they
experience.
can be really loud.
Yeah, and it was very clearly upset and yelling, kind of yelling.
But I love the fact that it took all the stuff and put it on the front step. That's
right. It's like,
fabulous.
you did this. Yeah. Also, in the Jewish Annotated New Testament, they talk about the burying, and that's a way to, like, keep it hidden from thieves. So it's probably something like that that's happening.
Sure. I would imagine that he probably didn't try to take a bite out of the talent, though.
The talent. Yeah, probably not. And then in verse 24, we read, "Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward." This is that same one when the master gets back, saying, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed." And the master gets, like, mad about this, but, like, honestly, slave owner and capitalist versus enslaved person, I'm with the one who received 1 talent on this. Like...
No, absolutely.
It's literally what you're doing right now.
And also, let's keep in mind that the folks who Jesus was talking to were probably more in that category than they were the rich folks having money to manage. So, but I'm absolutely on board with you. Yeah. And then in verse 27, we read, "Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest." And, I mean, sure, maybe, like, that's an option for what could have happened, but also let's remember that these were not FDIC-protected banks, and so, because they didn't have those back then. The country did not insure your accounts with bankers the way that America does now. And so if those banks had failed, the guy would have lost everything, and probably still would have blamed this one dude for that, right? Let's be clear. So I realized not everyone else's parents turned the movie It's a Wonderful Life into a lesson on the history of banking and the importance of federally insured accounts, which really explains so much about my childhood. Oh my goodness. Sorry, I'm having a moment. But if they had, I think a lot of the crypto bros who have been losing their shirts lately might have been a little smarter about what they did with their money. Like, don't gamble stuff you can't afford to lose. So.
Yeah. I mean, the crypto bros who are creating the cryptocurrency probably still would have done that. Yeah. But the ones who get, like, sucked into it, yeah, for sure. Speaking of, in verse 29 we read, "For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away." And I'm apparently on a Hunger Games kick today, but this is like the Hunger Games economy with the capital and the districts. The capital has, and so they are given more, and they're to the point where, like, they don't even have to do anything to earn it right now. And then those who don't have, it's taken away from them. And then it plays out even, like, microcosm in the districts, where districts, like, 2 and, like, the special career districts have and are given more. And that comes from the resources of District 12 and 11 and 10 and all of them.
Sure.
And now for our most talented segment. Let's make a Muppets musical.
Yay.
Okay, who's got talent?
Well, in the Muppets, everyone.
See what I did there?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's true.
Goodness. So basically, the mental image I have for this set of readings now is someone sort of looking around in the dark for something that they buried, because it's a combination of all that stuff about darkness and lamps from the first couple readings, and then the buried talent from the last reading. And so if I'm imagining a Muppet going looking for something in the dark and having to, dig stuff up to get to it, I think it's Elmo with the gardening gloves. That would be very fun. And I imagine that he might wind up, like, collecting a collection of Muppets to come with him as that happens. They find out that he's looking for something that he buried and realize that, let's not leave Elmo alone doing this. And so he gets a collection of people coming with him, and then it just turns into a bigger and a bigger and a bigger thing. And that could be very fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it.
How about you?
That's adorable. So my immediate reaction to my introduction of this segment was Gonzo, and I don't know where, because Gonzo the Great definitely has talent.
Super talented.
Yeah, and I just today shared one of Gonzo's tweets where he goes, "Does anyone know any whales named William? I am desperate to find one for my latest stunt. I call it, where there's a will, there's a whale." And I love that. And so I'm stuck in, like, how A, Gonzo does have the talent, and B, Gonzo would totally use the, like, word talent to, like, do the thing that Kay and I sometimes roll our eyes about that pastors do of, like, how are you burying your talents and not using them for God?
Although if you're going to do a stunt with whales, please make sure that, you know, the caretakers of the whales agree with you on their health and safety during it. Like,
yes, and that the whales agree.
No whales injured in the making of this stunt. Because Gonzo certainly would.
Yeah.
Make sure that they weren't.
Absolutely. Gonzo would be in communication with the whales the whole time. Make sure.
Although now I have a mental image of Gonzo and, you know, the whale shoots the water up through the blowhole and Gonzo is sort of hanging out on top of the fountain of water coming out of the blowhole and having a fabulous time. And that's pretty excellent.
That would be fantastic. I love that.
Because I guess I'm assuming that's what the stunt would involve. But
that's fantastic. I think that's like, I mean, you could have Gonzo bury the talent in the whale and then the whale, like, spurts it out. Sure. I like this.
Yeah, I realize it's almost certainly not anatomically possible for the whale to first swallow Gonzo and then spit Gonzo out through the blowhole, like, because otherwise you totally know Jonah would have wound up doing that in the Bible. Because God was a little peeved. But, yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks for joining us. Theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Laughlin, and Muppets music was by Brenda Boss. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the Reign of Christ. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and now Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, movie commentaries, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's definitely cheaper than a talent, or a denarius, actually, probably, too.
Yeah, or for that matter, a whale. Also, let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said,
Pax
vobiscum.